Welcome, everyone, and welcome to our Careers in Peacebuilding Talk Story series. My name is Jose Barzola from the Matsunaga Institute for Peace at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. Our talk story today will focus on appreciative inquiry and community transformation, restoring our past to reclaim our futures with Dr. Jeremy Simons. Thank you for joining us today to learn about a journey into the profession. Our co-sponsor today is the National Center for Peace and Conflict Studies Student and Community Association. That is a graduate student club at the University of Otago. The club is grounded in bicultural and multicultural values and principles. The club supports students studying at the National Center for Peace and Conflict Studies, NCPACS, and NCPACS, and engage the NCPACS, the wider university, and the community in justice, peace, and conflict transformation efforts, projects, and initiatives. Appreciative Inquiry, or AI, is a participatory and strength-based dialogue process for social change, community transformation, and organizational development. Storytelling is a key element in AI that makes it relevant to all kinds of organizations, from grassroots community organizers to Fortune 500 CEOs. Dr. Jeremy Simons will reflect on over a decade of using AI in a variety of contexts, from indigenous education in remote villages to community health initiatives and justice reform in the Philippines and the United States. Our special guest today has 20 years of community development and peace building experience and has just completed his PhD in the customary justice advocacy of Lumad indigenous peace activists in Mindanao, Philippines. Prior to his work in the Philippines, he was part of a team that established the first urban public-based restorative justice discipline initiative in Denver, Colorado, in the United States. And to get started, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Jeremy, or Dr. J, I believe, right?
Thanks, Jose. Yeah, and it's good to see everyone here. And yeah, thanks for that introduction. Maybe just we could start by people going around and introducing themselves real quick. Just say where you're calling from, where you're from originally, and why you're interested in this conversation.
We can do popcorn style. I will choose Laura, who I see on my screen.
Hi, my name is Laura Rouse. I am a PhD student at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. I'm also the graduate assistant for the Matsunaga Institute, so I'm here in the office with Jose today, calling in from Honolulu, obviously, and then I'm from California. I'm here just because, I'm excited to learn. Also, I am a restorative justice researcher as well, so very interested to learn from you today. And we're popcorning. Okay. Kaylika, sorry. Take it on you.
No worries. Yeah. Hello, everyone. I'm Kaylika. Happy to be here today. I'm joining from Aotearoa, New Zealand. I'm a PhD student at the National Center for Peace and Conflict Studies. Jeremy is one of our recent graduates. I'm still in the thick of things in my second year, but really excited. I've heard Jeremy facilitate before and it's amazing. So I'm back for more. And I'll go ahead and popcorn over to Raymond.
Hi, everyone. Thank you. My name's Raymond Taima. I'm originally from Canada. I live in Cambodia and I happen to be in Mexico right now, where there's a big storm brewing outside. I'm also an incoming PhD student at the University of Otago at the Peace Center, and waiting for the borders to open. And yeah, very interested. I work on listening and community participatory methodologies. I will popcorn it over to Ula.
Aloha, everybody. It's a long time since I did my PhD. I am actually from Denmark originally. I'm now with the University of Hawaii at Manoa and working on connecting, net weaving indigenous knowledges and what are we calling it? Science in a more traditional academic way. And we are looking for alternative ways of communicating, and storytelling is a really big issue. So I was curious to learn more about what Jeremy is doing. I'm Director of Civic Engagement for the College of Social Sciences and an anthropologist. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Pamela, and I'm on the unceded territories of the Duwamish in Seattle, named for their ancestral chief. And I'm Professor Emeritus at Seattle University, ironically. And always it's interested to see how we can connect the dots and create the Legos, or however we want to frame it. Very much like Laura, to see how these things intersect.
Great. Is that everyone? I think so. Jose, you didn't share. We'll let you off the hook this time.
Oh no, happy to share. Well, as I mentioned earlier, my name is Jose Barzola. My full-time job is here at the Matsunaga Institute for Peace. I am also a PhD student through the College of Education here. Embedding my PhD is in educational administration, higher ed, but with a focus on peace building specifically, and looking at the impacts of peace building certificates, graduate certificates specifically, onto career paths that people can pursue in that field. So really excited to get back to actually writing sometime soon once things kind of slow down with this pandemic. But yeah, it's been a wonderful journey nonetheless, being here at the university and being able to connect with you all, and as well as just continuing to build community. So thank you.
Great. Thanks again, Jose, for hosting this and for constantly reaching out to me, even when I was probably took a long time to reply to your emails. Appreciate it. So like Jose said, my name is Jeremy Simons. I was born and grew up in the Philippines. So I'll just share a little bit about myself, and then went back to the States after high school and went to university or college in the States in Massachusetts. And then worked for some years and went back to a graduate program in conflict transformation, and then was in Denver for about 7 years doing mostly restorative justice and community organizing work in this inner city there. And then moved to Mindanao, back to the Philippines, but to the southern island of Mindanao for another about 8 years to do peace building work. And then came to New Zealand, where I am now, to do my PhD, which I just finished this past year. Hallelujah. And am looking on to see what will happen next. So it's great to have this small group, and this is probably actually a good size for this kind of conversation. I'm just going to start out by actually telling a story from when I was in the Philippines. I was doing some outreach work at the city jail, the city that I was living in, which was Davao City, the city where the current president had been mayor at the time. But I was doing some outreach with a church-based program that just basically did visitation into the jail. Jail was horribly crowded, built for maybe 700 and had over 3,000 inmates in it. And so oftentimes what these programs would do would even just bring basic things like toothpaste and soap and whatnot into the jail, and then run some different programs, some psychosocial support type things and whatnot. So we worked with other sort of outreach programs that were working in the jail. And through our connections, we realized we started to hear reports from the inmates of inmates who were dying. And so now people do periodically die in jail, but this was quite at a higher or more frequent occurrence that was happening. And so we started to become concerned because it was almost every week another inmate would die. And this information would, of course, it wasn't being relayed by the jail officials, and the inmates themselves were quite concerned about this. So eventually what we did was we sort of made a bit of a public stir about it, and and brought it out to the wider community so that something could be done, because it didn't seem to be stopping. So what resulted was some conversation, a series of meetings, and a bit of an investigation as to why this had happened or was happening. And what we found out, and what people found out, was that in the jail, there were actually 3 jails in this facility. One was a sort of a men's main jail. There was a women's jail, and then there was also what they called the jail annex, which was a much smaller facility. They were all right next to each other, so you could almost not tell the difference. But a much smaller facility attached to the men's main jail, where sick, elderly, or otherwise vulnerable people inmates were supposed to be housed. And so what had happened was a new jail warden had come and taken over the administration of the jail. And when he came in, he realized that that sick inmates who were supposed to be in the annex to receive supposedly better care and attention had just been sort of over time and over the years had been mixed in through the general jail population. And so he decided, well, this isn't a good thing. Our annex is not serving its purpose, and these inmates will get better attention if we move them all together into the jail annex. So he did that. And what happened, not realizing that, in fact, what had developed for these inmates over time was an informal network of support. So people would bring them food, would get their medicines for them, help them out. And when they were suddenly all thrown together into the annex and cut off from that support, this is what actually led to the deaths that had occurred. And so it was not anything necessarily malicious. In fact, it was probably something done out of concern and with good intentions, but it had a horrible, really a terrible toll and effect on those inmates. And so it was one of those situations, and I tell that story to illustrate how, if you looked at the jail situation there, and it's, Philippine jails are some of the most crowded in the world, you would have said, well, this is inhumane, this is terrible, and certainly providing better, more concentrated care for elderly and sick inmates would be a good thing. But it didn't take into account that even within a very difficult, overcrowded, unjust situation, there was still a network of support and care and attention that was, though invisible, still existed. And when that was disrupted, there were actually very serious ramifications. And as a community development worker, it sort of sticks out to me in my mind as an experience that really points to the importance of one, listening to community and never assuming that there's a situation or a community or an individual who doesn't have anything to offer, or who is in such a horrible state that they simply lack any resources to do good or to help themselves or to support themselves. And so that was a really powerful story. Unfortunately, the consequences of that learning were, quite difficult for those particular people. So, but it's part of this. For me, it's also part of what appreciative inquiry is about, is trying to understand sometimes when we're working in a situation that, especially if we're in conflict transformation or peace building or restorative justice, situations that seem extremely difficult and extremely challenging. And sometimes it's easy to be hopeless or despairing. But to always remember that within these difficult situations, there are great assets, there are great resources at hand, and we have to constantly be aware that our good intentions don't actually end up making things worse. And appreciative inquiry is one way of understanding and viewing and working with communities, with groups, with organizations, even with individuals, to see how they can really be empowered. It's not about us giving them power, but them claiming their own power, their own resources and strengths to work together and to make the world a better place, which is, I think, why we're all here, why we're all in this sort of work together. And so what I'd like to do now is, before we go any further, I'm just going to share my screen. I'm going to share a little bit about what appreciative inquiry is, and then we'll have a chance to talk together a little bit more about it. So just give me a second. And before I do that, actually, I noticed a few more people who've joined in. Carolyn, I see, and Kat. And maybe Carolyn and Kat, you could do a brief introduction. We all introduced ourselves already, so you'll just have to go by our names, I guess. And but we'd like to just hear from you and let us know where you're from and why you're interested in this conversation.
Aloha, and I apologize for blocking my screen. I just came from yard work and I'm so grimy and all that. But appreciative inquiry is something I've always been interested in ever since I was a student intern with the Hawaii Community Foundation, which was years ago. It's because my introduction to the community here is because I'm Filipino. I wanted to know more about the Filipino community here. And at the time, all the materials that I could really read was problems and issues. But what that internship helped me do is to really think about it in a different way. And now, of course, there's a methodology and thinking process called appreciative inquiry now. And I think it's a very good mind process, actually. And so even with everything that I'm doing right now, it's the same line. When you're thinking about Hawaii, it's the same thing. You talked about prison system. That's the same thing. I worked briefly within the prison system here. And it's the same thing. I think we have to mold our minds so that we appreciate certain things. And sometimes it's a conscious effort to know how to inquire. But sorry for it's taking so long. I'll pass it on to Kat Brady. Aloha. Yeah, by the way, I'm connected with the Urban and Regional Planning Department. I'm a graduate student, and my material, I'm working right now on two things, which is urban planning in Baguio City. Again, that also takes another appreciative inquiry approach. And here it's about using the power of home food gardening to cope with whatever our situation here is. And it's surprisingly not mentioned in any of our urban planning projects and plans, etc.
Thank you so much, Carolyn. Kat, are you there? And I know also Janelle also just joined us. So we're just doing some introductions to try to get to know everybody who's in our audience today.
I don't know if Kat's there, but I can go ahead and introduce myself.
Thank you.
My name is Janelle, and I'm not quite sure. I just actually just saw your email. I'm not sure what kind of introductions you're looking for. I apologize. I know I'm tardy.
No worries. It was mostly a name, what brings you to today's event. If you want to share a little, if you happen to be in school, you want to share something about your research. It's kind of open.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Thank you.
So I just kind of was just interested in the topic about peaceful conflict and how to be able to, de-escalate and just ways of having that dialogue. I'm a return Peace Corps volunteer, and I'll be going into start graduate school in January in international development and service. And I just really have a passion for being able to connect people. And can you hear me? Am I having an echo?
We can hear you. Thank you.
Oh, okay, great. And so I just really have a passion of being able to be a bridge for people. I feel like so much conflict is based off of like lack of understanding or not being able to have everybody's perspective heard before people are just reactionary of wanting their way enforced. And so I was just very curious as to what you were going to share today. So that's what inspired me to join. Thank you.
Thank you. Kat, are you with us today, or I don't know? I've known Kat for some time, and I know she's normally quite chatty, so I think there might be some kind of connection issue.
Maybe we can keep checking in with Kat
Yeah,
and
we'll
move
do.
along.
Yeah, we'll do.
Um,
Trying to send her a message.
Yep, cool. So thanks, Janelle and Carolyn. Kumusta? And welcome to our conversation. So I'm just going to share my screen briefly and just go through a little bit about some of the sort of the thought and thinking behind appreciative inquiry. It's not something that appeared yesterday. It's been around for a wee while. And then we'll have a little bit of time just to discuss and maybe to do a little bit of appreciative inquiry ourselves. So, yeah. Sorry, just getting my screen. Can everyone see that? Are we good? Sweet. So here we are. Yes, appreciative inquiry, even have the date correct, I think. Wonderful. So there's a quote here that says, if you want to build a ship, then don't drum up men to gather wood, give orders, and divide the work. Rather, teach them to yearn for the far and endless sea. And I think my mentor, the guy who taught me appreciative inquiry, Terry LeBlanc, a Mi'kmaq native Canadian from Eastern Canada. This is actually drawn from his training materials, and he always opened up his training with this quote. And I think it's something powerful that tells us that dreaming and visioning for what we long for in our deepest selves is what will help us move forward and pull us into the future, but grounded on where we're coming from and where we have been. So it's not so much about a technical approach to work, but about a more organic and the envisioning approach to how we move into the future and do our work. So appreciative inquiry is really a positive way. It's a form of asset-based community development. Some would say there's other forms of it out there. You can do a search on the web. Appreciative inquiry, though, is particularly useful when working with groups and individuals in terms of planning processes and in terms of evaluation and building in the process, building up the strength and the sort of the spirit of the team or the organization that you might be working with. So appreciative inquiry is based on this idea that words are tools. And it's very important to understand that the words that we use shape the worlds that we see and understand. And I think we can understand this. For example, if I use a term like a Filipino term called bayanihan, and Carolyn would probably know what bayanihan means. It's sort of a term that means collaboration or community effort. And Carolyn, you can add in what, perhaps what that all entails. But actually, if you say bayanihan, immediately the image that comes to mind in the Philippines would be a group, a family, or community coming together and actually picking up someone's house, a house that traditionally would have been built on stilts and or posts, and putting posts along the side and then literally carrying the house and moving it together. So it has this whole sense of community spirit of people working together to accomplish something. And it's a real good demonstration, I think, in my mind, of how words shape worlds and how those are all so much connected to the cultures that we come from. And it also tells us that if you speak in the negative, it creates a negative reaction and therefore a negative future. But if you affirm, if you speak positively, then others will respond in like manner. And the outcome will be much more different, or will be much more, will really depend upon the kinds of words and the ways that we use our words. And so of course, appreciative inquiry. To appreciate means valuing, recognizing, affirming the past and present, our strengths and potentials, anything that gives health, life, and strength to a living system. So, some of the synonyms would be valuing, prizing, esteeming, honoring. It's really looking into what is positive in a particular situation or community. And of course, to inquire is to undergo the act of exploration or discover, to ask questions, to research, to explore, look, and be open to new potentials and possibilities. So when we put appreciate and inquire together, appreciative inquiry, it really sort of encompasses the process that we're looking at. And this is really based on a process of storytelling. And so before we go on further, what I'd actually like us to do, and maybe we can split into two groups, Jose, and we'll talk about this question. And I'm going to ask people in each group to share their stories with each other. And we're telling stories about stories, if that makes any sense. But what I'll ask you to do is really think about a time that you had an experience with a story where a story was told and it had a very powerful effect or impact on you. And so it's really up to you what this could mean or what this looks like. But just tell a story with the other two people in your group. We'll break out into breakout rooms about what was the most powerful story you ever heard. What did you like about it? How did you feel after you heard it? Where did you first hear it told? Who was involved? Okay, so that's sort of our what we would call an appreciative inquiry a discovery question, and we'll talk more about that. And what I like in our groups of 3 is for the other 2 people to really listen well and try to tease out from the storytelling what were the key elements or aspects of that story that made it successful or made it work or made it powerful. And then just try to note those down or tuck them away in your mind. And we'll share with some of those things afterwards. And you can share those in your group together, and then we'll come back as a large group and share with each other. So I'm just going to stop sharing my screen. Anyway, there's the instructions actually, but does everyone have a sense of before I do that, what the instructions are about, how this is going to work, and what the discovery question is? So I just was wondering, like to hear a few reflections on that process, on what we sort of took away. What were some of the key elements that came out of your conversations about stories? The one thing I'll ask is, don't retell the whole story, each story, because we'll be here a long time. But you could maybe share a few highlights and then sort of what you guys came to as to what were the key elements that came out of those stories about stories. And we'll do popcorn. So I will ask, Carolyn, since I was in her group for a while before I kicked myself out, accidentally left the meeting altogether. But I did make it back in, fortunately. Carolyn, maybe you were, where's Raymond? Yeah, there you are. Sorry, could share a little bit.
Maybe Raymond can give a 2-liner of a synopsis of his story. Then I'll give mine, and then we will share what we thought were the common things. Because I like you to highlight what you want to highlight.
Okay, no, my story is about a blind Cambodian woman who grew up in a very difficult time just during the genocide period, and ended up becoming quite a well-known leader in massage therapy. Despite all odds against her, she was able to really become a leader for disability now in Cambodia. And her life story inspires me every day and has made me really get involved in what I do because of her story. So thank you.
Yeah, and my quick story is about my grandfather, who I never knew, but I learned his story through the chanting during his funeral. That he actually helped a lot of children go to school, come rain, come shine, by carrying them, crossing rivers and all that. And he was, I guess we were talking about the Cordillera Mountain region, so you can just imagine a strong man trying to bring children to school. And I will start with what we said was common, I think, was that these two people were close to us. That's something. And then, of course, they're empowering. And then they seem to also face adversity. And maybe Raymond can add more.
Sure, thanks, Carolyn. Yeah, exactly what Carolyn just said. I think it's really interesting. We kind of chose heroes for both of us. They're heroes, and they're people who inspire us through their stories. And they're people that have made a mark in our own lives as well. We both chose similar figures in our life in that way. And that was really interesting.
Thank you, Raymond and Carolyn. And why don't you all pick the next person in their group can go?
Sure, I'll go with the person beside me on the screen, Laura.
All right. I guess sticking with the same format, the story that I told was one that I heard when I was in congregate care in high school. We did these character building trips that in hindsight were somewhat racist, but we learned from a Native American man a story about, it was like an oral tradition story about a hummingbird that all the other animals said it was too small. It's a long story, but all the other animals said was too small to accomplish what it wanted to. And with the support of the other birds was able to like fly up. And I don't know, it just, for me, it taught a lot about like teamwork and believing in yourself. And I think that something that was central to all three of our stories was character building and also some kind of intercultural impact. I think that Pamela and Janelle's stories had at least a somewhat similar focus. Theirs were both a lot more interesting than mine, so I will let them take it over from here.
That was not at all true. Your story was awesome.
I know. I'm ready for you. So my story was about a trip to Kenya and the lessons that we gleaned from and learned from the women that we encountered of essentially the legend or the legacy of being reminded of the stolen ones, the people who were kidnapped and stolen, and that they left families and homes, and that they were missed and loved, and they had been told through the generations that they would return. And so that's what they were waiting for, the return of the stolen ones, to remind them and let them know that they were missed. So, and I would say what I learned from Laura's story was that many cultures have similar stories and that are told with the similar morals and or lessons. And so just as she told the story of the hummingbird from the perspective of the First Nations or indigenous, you know, we have a similar story in the African tradition. So it's another connection across cultures. And the same with Janelle. I'll let her tell her story.
Yeah, my story was just was about a Tibetan monk and his student and the monk was trying to get to a far off distance to see his master, and had a student that was supposed to help him travel. But the student, you know, it was a bad vehicle, and they were trying to go over this mountain, and it was very treacherous, and the student didn't think he could do it, but he was able, after a lot of challenge, able to successfully get over the mountain. And as soon as he did, he sighed with relief and was cheering and was so happy. And the car broke down, and then the monk became angry that he never got him to his final destination. And the whole kind of moral and focus of the story was to like keep your eye and like keep your focus on the final outcome and not get sidetracked and derailed by the small challenges ahead of time.
All right, so I think that was the three from that group. Before we move on, anything else you wanted to add, or that's good? Okay, why don't you choose someone else, the last group?
Kat, does your team go?
Yep. And it's really interesting because just about everybody is talking about connection. And that's what we talked about. My story wasn't it was sort of, it didn't start out being happy because I work with people who are incarcerated. So, but it turned out really happy, and how this man totally turned his life completely around. And it was because he finally felt he belonged, that he was connected to something, and now he's a business owner. So things can happen. Kalika, I hope you tell your story, because she told a beautiful story that a friend of hers from Cameroon actually experienced. And what it was her family was really going through rough times. She was a kid, maybe, I don't know, under 10 years old. And she was at the market. They gave her money to whatever they had to go buy maize so the family could eat. And by the time she got to the market, the money was gone. She lost it somewhere. And she was sitting there feeling really sad. And somebody she didn't know, a man, came up to her and said, "What's the matter, little girl?" And she told him she lost her money. He bought the maize for the family. And she's now in her 40s. And it was that story changed her life. She saw goodness. And I think that was really powerful for her. And Ula talked about a science teacher bringing students to, as teachers she worked with, bringing students to a work day. And it was about climate change. And they went in, the students, believing that they could educate the community. And when they actually met the community, they found out that the community knew a hell of a lot more than they did. And, and it was, I think, maybe humbling for them, but also eye-opening about where knowledge can be found everywhere if you're awake. So I love the stories of connection. We're social beings, and it's so cool that we were all on the same wavelength. And I think that's because of you, Jeremy. Good positive energy. I gotta hop off. I got another meeting at 5, but mahalo. Nice to meet everybody. Hui ho.
Thank you, Kat. All right, so yeah, so a lot of really interesting, really diverse stories that we all heard. And everything from learning teamwork and character building to intercultural impact, to finding similarities in stories across cultures as a way of sharing and bridging across cultures. Stories that were about overcoming adversity, that were inspiring, that helped develop closeness and empowerment, and also demonstrated connection, transformation, the importance of community strengths, and that knowledge can be found anywhere. And so I think what we see is that when we tell stories and when we experience stories, it brings out a lot of good things. And I guess what I'd like to ask everyone is, what was it like to be in your group? What are your reflections not on the stories themselves, but on the process, even just that short time of sharing stories together. What were some things that sort of stand out to you about that process?
Oh, I think we said we like to listen. We like listening to good stories. So that was what came out in that group.
It wasn't difficult.
I think in our group, we were talking a little bit about how like words are really important and also like how stories can like impact us. So I agree with Raymond. You're mentioning too in your group that there was kind of this like, you know, people who've impacted our lives or heroes. So yeah, I definitely feel in my case that, you know, something that my friend told me, you know, it is her story, but it definitely reframes sometimes how I approach situations. So the impact that our words have on other people and how they frame their environment and how they approach things. So yeah, I think we were talking about kind of like the power of words.
I really enjoyed being able to hear the impact, like the stories from the other two ladies in my group. You know, it was very ready. They were able to share because it had made such an impact in their life. And I think that that's one of the beautiful things is being able to share, like have an experience that can then be retold into a story, or even hearing a story and then being able to share it. And then that impact ripples out and continues.
Yeah, Jeremy, I would add from the overview that you gave, you know, the stories, depending on what the intentions of the stories are, help to shape the narrative that you want to convey. So in my case, the story, I tell the story with intention because it does evoke a different vision and viewpoint than people traditionally or typically have. And so that's, you know, I'm trying to shift the narrative from a negative to a positive, you know, as, you know, more affirmative versus what we tend to drag along over time.
Yep. Any other thoughts? We don't need to sort of belabor this, but anyone else want to add anything in? If not, then we'll move on, and we can feel free to, you know, something comes to mind, we can add it in later. I'm just going to go back to my PowerPoint actually for a little bit. And I see Ulla as it's added in comforting and safe. Thanks, Ulla. Yes, I think that's really another key aspect of the storytelling. So I'm just going to go back to this and share my screen. Just give me a second. So we just had a chance to talk about the story. And kind of go through this process. And like we said, this is the basic approach, is storytelling through appreciative inquiry. And just even in our little discussion, we can see why that is so powerful, the way that words are so important for shaping how we interact, shaping the narratives, the stories, how then shape and frame our narratives. And they really help us connect with people and connect across cultures. We find that stories have a way of bridging that, and especially in peace building, conflict transformation, that's one of the things we're really trying to do. And so stories help us do that in a very natural way. At the same time, they're affirming what's unique and special about each person, each individual, each community, and even helping us connect rather across generations. Like I think Carolyn's your story about the chanting in your grandfather's funeral. And they really can bring out the strengths, the positives of what has worked, how people like we said, have overcome adversity, and what is going well. So storytelling is a way of gathering holistic information, not only the facts, but also our affective or the feelings that we experience in any particular situation. And it's all part of, for appreciative inquiry, the importance is really about creating that environment, that asset-based or that strength-based environment. And storytelling is really the main way that we do that, asking positive questions. We're listening to those stories, we're recognizing those individual gifts and skills, the relationships and community, the assets within the community and within partners, if we're doing this with partners. And it's encouraging and tapping into our imagination, right? Because we can sort of visualize that and imagine and see in our mind's eye what is happening and what is going on. And so appreciative inquiry has been defined by this a 4-step, some would say there's a 5-step process, but a 4-step process of discovery, dream, designing, and delivering. And so if you were to go through this whole process, that could actually take quite a bit of time. But this first part is really the foundation, the storytelling around a discovery question. And the discovery question is what sets the tone, and asking a question in the right way, in a way that actually draws out the positive and the good, is a critical and important skill. And so I'll go over that a little bit as we go along, but that discovery provides that foundation. And what comes out of that is the best of what is. So it's what's giving life to the organization, to the partnership or the community, or even to individuals. And it's the unique factors or high points that make something possible. And in appreciative inquiry, we call that the positive core. And what I tried to do as I was listening is I tried to draw out some of those things and just re-emphasize them at the end, which is the positive core of a storytelling or an asset-based environment. And that those are the things that we want to capture and hold on to or build on as we go forward. And they're sort of the touchstones that when we might be wondering, oh, are we on the right direction? Are we headed in the right way or working in the right way? These things will help us come back to those core elements that say, yes, this is what we are and what we want to be about. So these are the raw materials of our accomplishments, successes in the past, our achievements and successes, and they become then part of the present as well. So that is our positive core. Any questions before, as we go along, please feel free to jump in. Because I'm on share screen, I can't really see everyone who's here. But so you might just have to sort of interrupt. You'll be allowed to interrupt if you have a burning question as I'm talking. So the positive core, when you're looking at sort of what is this positive core, or what are we hoping to find, it's really looking at the achievements, the strategic opportunities, our personal collective strengths. It could be any number of things that emerge through storytelling, innovations, best practices, just the positive emotions that we have, collective wisdom, competencies, visions, core traditions and values, what is often called social capital, and embedded knowledge. So someone also in our stories, we talked about the different kinds of knowledges that can be found in communities. So even material assets are also a part of what can be our positive core. And these positive images about life come from our positive experiences and histories, the stories that we have. And to sum it up, we could just say we got to where we are because something worked. And that's what we're tapping into by asking people to tell stories. We're really asking people to tell positive stories, not just any old story, but positive stories of successes are really about helping us remember that we got here because something has worked out, and no one would be here today if things hadn't been working at some point or all along, in fact. So these asset-based methods, just to step back a little bit, when we look at sort of the world around us and people trying to bring change to the world and the way that the world seems to be interconnected in so many ways and closer ways. These are so needed when we are in this current reality, and we're asked to do more, and it's oftentimes asked to do more with less resources, and we're struggling to find where are the resources that we can find to do the things that we need to do. Appreciative inquiry is so important because it looks at the whole system. It's actually going to the core of the system, that positive core, and addressing it holistically instead of breaking it down. And this is can be a challenge for people who, for those of us trained in a very Western way of thinking, we really like to sort of break things down and, try to tear it apart. And if we do that, we'll be able to certainly figure out what's going on, what's going wrong. Asset-based methods really turn that whole approach on its head and say, let's find out what's going right. We're not denying that there might be things that need improvement that aren't going well, but we set them aside for the time being because we really want to affirm and tap into and understand what is working well. So they're super flexible. This kind of approach can be used with small groups, with large organizations. My understanding is the city of Chicago has tried to do this at one point. So it's almost the possibilities are endless. And like I said, it's already a more organic. It taps into ways of being, ways of communicating that don't require a lot of technical knowledge or expertise. Don't even have to even be literate. I've done this process with indigenous communities in the Philippines where people were, they did not really necessarily even know how to read or write or communicate well or at all in English. Again, it actually puts the strengths of the people, the participants at the center of the process and makes it an inclusive thing so that everyone has the capacity to participate. So if we look, those are really the strengths, the characteristics of an asset-based process. This is really in contrast to deficit-based problem-solving models where we start with problems. We say, okay, it may be good for fixing your car if your car has a flat tire. Okay, let's look at what's caused that flat tire and fix it. But most of the time in our work, in our lives, we're dealing with living systems, complex systems that are constantly changing and adapting at the same time as complexity theory says systems reach sort of equilibriums and sort of homeostasis or stability. And so how do we actually engage in systems that are so complex, so full of change as well as stability? So deficit methods are also oftentimes focused too much on what worked before or too much about figuring out what happened in the past with those past issues as opposed to looking at what is happening now based on the strengths of the past. So, and they don't really give us a positive image for what the future will look like. That first quote of, yearning for the far and endless sea, that's what's going to pull us through, and that vision is what's going to keep us going. So deficit problem-solving models don't really provide those alternatives because we end up getting fatigued by the same vision or looking at the same things, and sometimes it's like that whole struggle of, trying to do the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. That's the definition of insanity. So, and when we are trying to identify problems, it's too easy for people to associate the problem with the person or to feel attacked and blamed when we're talking about problems. And so that defensiveness and that sort of attitude or response becomes really problematic for building up teams, for building up strengths, and for really allowing and facilitating or building this space where creativity can occur. Because we're not going to be creative if we feel like we're being blamed for problems. Rather, that's what ultimately leads to that siloing and self-protection because of that fear, and that's not a characteristic of a healthy organization. So these are just some of the things that why we sort of avoid, why I avoid, and I believe the appreciative inquiry approach, strength-based approaches are so valuable and effective and important. So I'll just go through this real quick. This is sort of a typical problem-solving deficit-based type approach. You look at the problem, the root causes, do some brainstorming. Okay, what is the impact? Okay, what's the solution? And then we'll develop an action plan and implement it. So it seems good on the surface, and sometimes it can be used in certain types of fairly simple or maybe more mechanical problems, but is not really a great way to help us bring life and bring sort of success to the organizations that we work with. The asset-based approach, like appreciative inquiry, is really identifying, valuing what gives life. So it's a much more dynamic approach, and it's envisioning what could we do now based on what has worked and what is currently working, and then figuring out, okay, let's take it forward and work with it. So it's also very much conducive to promoting collaboration and more egalitarian decision-making and inclusiveness in designing programs or in project planning and those sorts of activities. So we can even see that sort of over the scope of history, there's been certain times where these different approaches have been done, and we've seen that they've not worked well, and they've had actually quite serious negative consequences over time. So I understand that we are pressed for time, so I'm just going to go through this quickly. This last little part. So I was talking about, I mentioned earlier that whole thing of how do we design questions that draw out what works, or what is to draw out the best, the proverbial best in a person. And this little, just some examples of how we can reframe these questions. So the biggest, instead of asking, what is the biggest problem here? We could say, what could we do that we haven't thought about yet? Or maybe you're working with someone who's comes from a really hard background. And it's so easy to say like, oh, why, or for the person to think, why do I have to be born into such a, difficult situation? But we could switch it around and say, well, what does it look like when our family or our community is at its best? Oh, leadership. Leadership is one of the loneliest jobs around. Why do our leaders blow it so often? But what could we do? Maybe we need to think differently. What could we do, we and our leaders both do, so that we are successful or that we win together? And rather than focusing on why do we still have all these problems, we could really talk about how can we be creative and plan for a better future. So these are just a few of some of the little, tricks, some of the strategies or ways of forming and asking questions that help generate this positive response and this positive storytelling that brings energy to our interactions and our activities. So again, it's about creating space where creativity can happen, where positive energy can be built, and where it becomes like a pivot point of relationships, of rapport, and then of positive change building off of that. So it allows us, it's so easy to get caught into sort of a negative approach. I was doing an evaluation once and on an activity we did, and I sat down and I started out by saying, okay, let's talk about, what worked well, how did this conference go? What were the highlights, or when did you have this sense that, yeah, this was working well? So we were about to go through with this is conference planning staff. Before we could even start the first person sharing, the senior person in the room, the program manager, said, look, all we going to talk about is the good things from this conference? So it was really interesting, because I thought, well, we can get to the challenges, but it was almost like you couldn't have an evaluation if you didn't at least, you really need to make sure you really brought up the bad things and the problems. So again, appreciative inquiry does not ignore problems, but it does try to keep them in their place and in a place that makes them something that is actually something that can be transformed. And by focusing on the strengths, you're actually we inherently address the problems when we focus on the strengths and assets, because those strengths and assets are always in reference to the context and the situation and the issues that are at hand, even if we don't necessarily talk about it. So, but it's really important that there's something about this whole way of thinking that needs to change, and that is sometimes a challenge for us to change. And it's not only the external dialogue between people, but that internal self-talk that sometimes is far more damaging and difficult to shift. So, and I probably have to apologize to Kalika early. I was in a bad space, Kalika, earlier, and so I was definitely not in my appreciative mindset. So this is a good reminder for me, actually, because it's so easy to get caught into these things. Yeah. So I think I'm just going to stop there because I've been sort of blowing through these slides, and there's a few more to go, but I'm just going to stop the screen share, and because I don't want to keep people up too late or too early or miss your lunch, whatever time zone you're in. We can have a little bit more conversation and wrap things up.
Well, I'll jump in with some comments. I don't know if anybody else has any, but I thank you so much. I just really appreciate it. When we talk about like positive, negative peace, I mean, appreciative inquiries definitely correlates and so in tune with positive peace. And even in my teaching styles, and I teach a lot of like online asynchronous, I'm very conscientious of what I put out there to my students, even just like a simple email or comments that I may, approach it with that appreciative inquiry mindset of not necessarily like you've missed out on so many assignments, you're going to fail, but like, hey, this is where you're at right now. Just would love to kind of connect and be able to have that dialogue. It creates a different ambiance. And I think as we're looking or striving to build community, I think it's one that definitely helps in that realm, as opposed to the opposite of it, definitely. And in a way, I kind of wish, they say it starts from the top down. So I wish leadership would practice it more often. It'd be a little bit more contagious in that way. And hopefully we'd all be like, just joyous and positive energy moving forward. And so thank you. That's just maybe really reflect upon how we approach all aspects of our life.
I did have one request. I'm assuming that last slide on reframing was the end. Could you give us at least one tip on reframing?
Oh, one tip on reframing. Okay, I'll show the slide. Since I showed the first part of it, it would be really cruel not to actually.
That's how I felt.
Yeah, no. And I couldn't remember how many slides I had after that. So now I can see, I have a whole several sample questions here. And that was really basically the end of at least what I thought we could accomplish today. So I'll just go through those. Because they are helpful when thinking about that whole idea and process of reframing. So we're looking at how do we reframe life into the inverse of the negative. So say you were in a project, you wanted to figure out how to partner between NGO and community members, right? And do that in a respectful way. So traditionally you might ask, how can we, help you improve your community? Not a bad question necessarily, but to shift that, to reframe it so that it's equalizing, we could ask, what does it look like when different people in the community, NGO included, are working well together? So then it's already sort of assuming that collaboration is possible, which it is, it's always possible. And it builds that into the question to frame how the inquiry or how the discussion and the dialogue will work going forward. So here's some other options. You know, again, how can our NGO services better meet the needs of community? It's so common. What are the needs of the community? How are we going to meet those needs? Well, how about we start out by asking, share a story of an experience while in community you saw a member or community member celebrating or valuing something. So instead of focusing on the community needs, it's focusing on what are the values or the things to be celebrated, to be affirmed that already exist in the community. So, and I'm happy to share these slides to send them in a file if you'd like to, you know, have a copy. I'll send them to Jose and he can send them out.
Thank you. Yeah, and I'll send it out to everyone who's here today. Much appreciated.
So again, say we wanted to evaluate an event we organized. I was just talking about this. What were our strengths and weaknesses as a team? All right. Rather, instead of just focusing on strengths and weaknesses, I just had a job interview where they asked me that. And we asked, well, share a story of your favorite moment during this event. I always end, you know, at the end of a job interview, which I've been doing several lately, they'll say, okay, now what questions do you have for us? And I say, well, what does it look like? What would it look like when, you know, this work or this role position is being, is successful or is going well? And so that sometimes puts the interviewers in a different mindset of, you know, what this interview is about. What is the best way to organize an event? It's such a simple question, not necessarily a bad question, but we can maybe expand that so we really are drawing out the story. What was the team doing when we were successfully running the event? How did people respond and react? What was your role? So it's really getting into that nuance, the, you know, the complexity, the interesting things that made this successful. What about just general community life? Here's, and this is, it doesn't have sort of a negative or a deficit-based question, but it's just sort of a deeper question to draw out good community life. And you can just read it there, you know, focusing on the past events, the people who've contributed to what works well or the positive essence of our community. And then you ask people to describe a time when you believe we were at our best. So those are some of the key ways of shifting, is asking people to describe something, to share a story about it, about when we were at our best, when we were, maybe it was, there was an aha moment or a peak experience during some an event. So there's a number of ways to try and draw out and to reframe our ways of dialogue, really, by using this appreciative approach. So again, it's trying to draw out what is the nuance of the story, so that as people tell stories, they're telling about their lives and about themselves. And it's actually, when you're working in a team, it really helps build that team ethos and the connections in the team. So this will be the last one, I think. Community development. When we are engaged in effective community development, there are outcomes we can identify. When you think of the work of community building, what are the essential elements and outcomes that come to mind? So you can really see how that's going to provoke a whole conversation, actually, around what's working, what are our core elements, what does it mean to be building community and to be effective. And again, it's not, you know, especially when we're doing like program evaluations, people want to know, well, what does effectiveness look like? What are the indicators? What are the outcomes? And so appreciative inquiry actually helps frame that whole process. You can still kind of mix some of those, you know, more structured, well, appreciative inquiry is actually quite structured, but what sometimes feel a bit more right-brained, I guess, processes with appreciative inquiry, but then plugging those in together to talk about effectiveness in a meaningful, way and in a way that's defined by the community, not by the people on the outside who are trying to figure out, you know, what's going on. So yeah, that reframing is so important. Thanks for that question, by the way.
You know, you reminded me of, I use visuals a lot with this process. And so there's like a card deck called Visual Explorer, which is just random high impact images. Yep. And it helps people to channel a story, because sometimes it's hard for people to make that shift, that reframe, that shift into
Yep.
a positive or affirmative mind. But if the question is framed, then they have to look for an image that would be representative. It helps to concretize that thinking and develop this, because they have to develop a story, and then you can kind of do a content analysis of the themes that are emerge from the sharing of the stories. Because when you ask about the different communities, there'll be different positive terms that will emerge.
Yep.
That people are heartfelt, and
Yep.
that was another way to kind of bond the community. So since
Yeah,
I'm
and
teaching
you-
asynchronously, I don't have the luxury of the classroom to spread all those pictures out. So what I've done asynchronously is using Padlet is charge the students with finding an image to respond to the question.
Yep.
So they're gonna have to go on a treasure hunt.
Right. Right. And what we, you know, what we've done in the past are oftentimes the next step in that 4D cycle, they call it discovery, the dream, is you actually create a statement pulling out the core elements that you've identified from those stories. You actually then create a statement that sort of captures what is the vision of what we're looking like, or what this project or this partnership will look like at its best. So it's really a vision statement. But I've done that with groups where we had them, instead of, well, they would write the vision statement out, but then they would use creative arts and materials to actually illustrate that vision statement, rather than just simply having a text expression of it. And so it really allows that you can be quite creative with this process. Any other thoughts, questions, reflections? We've been going about an hour and a half now, and it's easy for time to get away from us when we're telling stories and having these kinds of conversations. Kaylika, this is your second time through now. Anything that sort of stands out that's maybe different? Maybe you're like, you did it better the first time.
No, it was excellent, really, Jeremy. I like to, like, I think, you know, integrating some of these elements of storytelling, there's so much like fertile ground to cover with appreciative inquiry. I think even the last time we did it too, we were like, we could keep going, because once we start talking about the positive things, it just kind of, I don't know, there's like a momentum and energy around that. So yeah, thank you. I learn something new every time. So thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for your support for all this. So what, oh, sorry, Jose, were you going to say something?
Oh, I would just wanted to share Ula's comment that was in the chat, just in case people hadn't seen it. But she talked about storytelling is, in a way, like poems, leaving room for imagination, creativity, disciplinary, interpretation, and learning. I agree with Kaylika's mention, loving the definition. I was going to actually ask, are there resources for people who want to learn further about appreciative inquiry? Or I mean, are there courses? I kind of wish we had one. In my mind, I'm like, love to develop one in the near future. Yeah, just what's available worldwide, I guess, open source, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, there actually is a lot of stuff on the web. There's a website from one of the, can't remember which university, the Appreciative Inquiry Commons, I think, has a lot of resources. Having a course, though, would be really great, and really looking at perhaps not just appreciative inquiry, but some of the other methods of, especially like community planning, large-scale community development. There's a whole sort of permutation of appreciative inquiry or asset-based methods around there. Maybe about more individual methods, you know, where you can use in one-to-one conversations. It's a little bit of like what you might call brief therapy, or yeah, that really ask people to tap into what has worked well. You know, what would it look like to take one step in a positive direction? So there's really a lot of different angles that are out there. I don't have any specific resources in mind. I have a little pamphlet or book actually on my bookshelf. I can look at that, see if maybe there's a PDF copy that's available, but tons of stuff. There's been some real recent research and writing around that on appreciative social movements. So how do we develop social movements, large scale, community change, especially when you're looking at the world today, authoritarianism, racism, all this stuff that is on our minds. How can we do that in a way that is really appreciative and positive and doesn't recreate the very violence and the very conflict that we're trying to actually escape? So I think there's some real interesting stuff out there.
I see a part 2 already of this dialogue.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks, Jose. That's good. And yeah, I mean, certainly creating a course would be, yeah, thanks. Thanks, Ula. That's the one. Champlain's Appreciative Inquiry website is really great. I'll send some, I'll look around after this, and I do have a few things I could probably send on as well.
Yeah, I just ask because I mean, it's easy to Google something, but then it's like so much information. So just kind of needle in a haystack. And what with you having been really skilled in the field, I would look toward your guidance. Definitely. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Yeah.
Any other questions from the audience? Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, maybe just to close things up, everyone could share one thing that they appreciated out of our conversation.
I can start. At the beginning too, when we hopped into breakout rooms, just saying like, I really just appreciate this time and space to think about this, because we tend to just be busy and go about our days and sometimes forget to exactly that, appreciate. So I just really, I feel really grateful for this space that you've created here. And yeah, thanks to Jose and Matsunaga Institute as well, and Jeremy for facilitating. Yeah, great conversations.
I agree with that. This has been a really long day full of meetings on Zoom for me. And this was my reward at the end of the day, and I really enjoyed it. Thank you so much.
I will ditto that and say that I was really happy to see it grounded around storytelling, because storytelling is the most significant human condition that we all share. And we often lose sight of its value.
Yeah, I actually thank the entire presentation today, because it reminds me of what I need to focus on in terms of when we refer to AI. The only reason why I say that is because I think ever since COVID started, I've been wanting to write this essay I call the AI Cube, referring to we need ancestral intelligence, we need artificial intelligence, but we also need to approach it from an appreciative inquiry, because that's a prescription for everybody around the world to have ancestral intelligence, artificial intelligence, but every different place will really start from somewhere. And I think appreciative inquiry will define the ethos, or where do we start? And I think any place will, I think the storytelling is the one that will, and the framing that you had, the questions, the kind of questions are the things I thought I said, let me revisit those and think about them, especially in planning.
Yep.
Yeah, I also want to thank you really much. I think this space was really wonderful, and thank you for making it a two-way, actually a multi-way space where we could share stories, because I find it really fascinating how we relate to our own stories and how we relate to when others are telling their stories. And I really appreciated very much listening to other stories, and couldn't help to relate them to myself and to the stories I know. And I think it's a real connector, and very, very grateful for that opportunity today. Thank you.
I guess I'll close. Is everyone gone? And I just really appreciate everyone's sharing. There's always a little insight, a little nugget, maybe a big nugget of wisdom that emerges. Really loved it. And thank you, and happy to stay in touch and to keep some conversations going. And wish everyone the best in whatever endeavors and however you might choose to apply this or to work with this, to struggle with this sometimes. I wish you the best, and I know it will be positive and productive. So thanks again, Jose. Thanks, Matsunaga Institute, and blessings to everyone.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. I'm going to do one last closing. Just want to truly thank you for just allowing us to learn further about your work in Appreciative Inquiry, just the wealth of knowledge that can guide us in future peace-related projects. Truly appreciate you opening about what your experiences, the lessons. And I imagine there's so much more. I wanted to really hear, and maybe for another day, the stories on your work in the Philippines, and just so many tips that have come out from this dialogue. And I really love the community building that you've kind of developed in today's dialogue, just everyone being involved. And there is such great power in storytelling. And I'm glad that we're slowly trying to bring that back. It's not like it's something new. It's been around for some time, but many times we forget about the power of just going back to some of the basics. Really, that's really what it kind of comes down to. So thank you for your kindness and leadership in the field as we explore our own journey into the profession. Also, thank you to everyone who joined today's event. Deeply appreciate your interest in supporting, joining us to learn about exploring careers in peace building through this series. Thank you again, everyone.